The first thing you feel isn't plot, it's pressure. The weight of a name that was once carved into glass towers and boardroom doors, now spoken like a ghost story in the backseat of a stranger's car. On Scenecraft Review, this is the kind of film that doesn't ask for your attention with explosions or speeches. It takes it with a single controlled inhale, with a camera that lingers half a beat too long on a man's hands gripping a steering wheel, and with a sense that somewhere behind the everyday noise of a modern city, an old betrayal is still ticking like a hidden clock. The movie's 2026 sheen is unmistakable in its surfaces: sleek architecture, cold lead reflections, the sterile glow of elevator mirrors, but it refuses to be impressed by any of it. The cinematography keeps insisting that power is not the skyline, power is the shadow it casts on the street. That visual philosophy becomes the film's first quiet thesis. The world can build monuments to money, but it's the unseen men, drivers, doormen, assistants, replacements, who learn the true weight of consequence. The opening sequence is almost perversely patient, watching Ian not as a titan, but as a substitute driver, a man who ferries other people's lives home while his own sits locked behind his eyes. And the shot choice tells you everything. We don't get a heroic close-up, we get him framed through the rear-view mirror, his face bisected by a thin line of reflected city lights, as if the man is literally split between who he was and who he pretends to be. The sound design is doing something surgical here. You hear the soft rasp of fabric as he adjusts his jacket, the faint click of a turn signal, the wet hush of tires on late-night pavement. The score doesn't arrive like a melody, it arrives like a low-frequency pulse, the kind you feel more than you hear, like an approaching train you can't yet see. It's a sonic motif that follows Yang throughout the early act, never rising into melodrama, never giving you permission to relax. It creates the sensation that Yi's calm is not peace, it's discipline. He is not healed, he is contained. What makes Yi's mean instantly compelling is the way the performance treats silence as a language with grammar. This actor, whoever cast him understood the assignment, plays Yi like a man who has spent 2 decades practicing invisibility, and now invisibility has become muscle memory. When a drunken client laughs too loudly in the back seat, Yi doesn't flinch. When another client barks in a dress like a command, Yi doesn't react. But the camera watches the smallest betrayals of composure, the jaw tightening for half a second, the eyes briefly hardening, the knuckles widening and then releasing. The film wants you to notice what Yi doesn't allow anyone else to notice. It wants you to sit inside the tension between restraint and eruption. And then, with the confidence of a story that knows exactly how much information to withhold, the movie starts folding time. It doesn't smash cut into the past with obvious filters. It lets the past leak in through triggers. A corporate logo on a billboard, a familiar last name mentioned casually on a radio business segment, a champagne advertisement featuring a gala Yi once owned. The flashbacks arrive not like exposition dumps, but like involuntary memory. Too sharp, too bright, too fast to control. In those fragments, we see the old Yi tailored, sharp-eyed, moving through a boardroom like a man who believes the world is negotiable. The lighting in these past sequences is warmer, almost honeyed, but it's a deceptive warmth, like the glow inside a furnace. Gold tones, polished wood, soft highlights on crystal glasses. It looks luxurious, but it feels predatory. The betrayal that dismantled him is staged with an almost classical cruelty. The film doesn't frame it as a single act, but as a sequence of small doors closing, a meeting rescheduled at the last second, an ally avoiding eye contact, a contract amended in language designed to be misread. There's a scene, one of the first truly devastating ones, where Yi stands at the edge of a celebratory banquet, listening to applause meant for him, and the camera drifts behind his shoulder to show that the applause isn't aimed at Yi anymore. It's aimed at the man beside him, the man who is smiling too wide, the man whose hands are already touching what isn't his. In that moment, the betrayal isn't a knife, it's a transfer of oxygen. The room begins breathing for someone else. The writing is careful to make Yi's downfall feel like a system, not a soap opera. It suggests that the real weapon used against him was intimacy, knowing how he thinks, how he trusts, what he prioritizes. And that's what makes the later revenge narrative feel heavier than simple payback. Because if he was only robbed of money he could rebuild, what he was robbed of was a future in which trust was possible. The film frames this as a kind of psychological exile. He isn't merely forced out of his company, he is forced out of the version of himself who believed loyalty could be engineered. When Yi disappears, the movie refuses the melodramatic theatrics of death scenes or newspaper montages. It gives you absence as a texture, a chair that stays empty, a name removed from a directory, a security camera angle that mysteriously fails at the wrong moment. The implication is not just that Yi vanished, but that someone with immense influence erased the traces. The city keeps moving, the economy keeps spinning, and a man who once controlled entire sectors becomes less visible than a street lamp. That's one of the film's most quietly terrifying ideas. Modern power doesn't always kill you, sometimes it simply edits you out. 20 years later, the present-day Yi lives with a kind of ritualized minimalism. His apartment is functional, quiet, and slightly too clean, like a place designed to avoid leaving emotional fingerprints. The color palette turns slate and desaturated blue, not quite bleak, but definitely drained, like the world has been rinsed of warmth. There's a recurring visual of Yi washing his hands, not in a germophobic way, but in a deliberate way, as if he's trying to scrub off the sensation of history. He eats simply, sleeps lightly, and keeps his phone face down like it might explode with the wrong call. Every detail is communicating that Yi has been living not as a man, but as an emergency plan. And then the story introduces the one thing he cannot reduce to strategy: his son. The film handles the son with restraint, which is rare for stories like this. He isn't a prop. He isn't a flawless angel designed to make the father sympathetic. He's a young man shaped by absence, by the odd emotional geometry of being raised near someone who cannot reveal who he is. The son's presence in Yi's life is tender in a way that hurts, because it's tenderness under surveillance. Yi watches his son the way a bodyguard watches a VIP. The affection is real, but it is always filtered through threat assessment. There's a scene early on where Yi stands in the kitchen while his son talks about a job opportunity, and Yi's face barely changes. Yet the camera catches the micro shift when the son mentions a company name tied to Yi's past. The air in the room changes. Fridge hum grows louder in the mix. The movie is telling you that Yi's private life has been living inches away from a landmine. What's brilliant is how the film uses mundane routines as suspense. Yi driving his son to an appointment shouldn't feel dangerous, but the editing turns it into a pulse. A car behind them that stays a little too long, a pedestrian who pauses and looks twice, a phone vibrating with a number Yi doesn't recognize. These are not action beats, they're paranoia beats, and they're shot with a patient dread. The camera often stays inside the car with Yi, letting the outside world become a blur of uncertain shapes through tinted windows. It makes you feel what Yi feels. The city is not a place, it's a field of angles. The antagonist's re-entry into the story is handled with the same cold elegance as Yi's quiet suffering. We don't meet him with villain music and theatrical threats. We meet him through infrastructure, through a corporate event broadcast on giant screens, through a business magazine cover, through an award ceremony where he steps onto a stage and accepts applause like it's interests on a loan. He is older now, refined into something even more dangerous, a man who has learned to hide brutality behind philanthropy. The camera studies him with a different visual language than Yi. While Yi is often framed in partial reflections and obstructed lines, the antagonist is framed cleanly, centered, symmetrical, haloed by architectural lighting. It's an image of control, of someone who has successfully convinced the world that he deserves to be where he is. But the film keeps slipping in the cracks. When the antagonist smiles, it never quite reaches his eyes. When he shakes hands, the grip lingers a moment too long, turning courtesy into domination. In one scene, he stands alone after a public speech, and the applause fades into a dull roar, replaced by a thin ringing tone, as if the film is letting us hear the emptiness behind his performance. He is not a man who won. He is a man who took, and he is still afraid someone might take back. The narrative ignition point, the moment the entire film tilts, arrives not with a shootout, but with information. The antagonist's people find a thread, a paper trail, a face from an old file, a driver's license photo that looks too similar to a ghost. It's staged like a thriller, but played like horror. There's a sequence in a dim office where an investigator lays out documents under a desk lamp, and the light slices through darkness like a scalpel. The camera moves slowly, almost respectfully over the evidence. A new name, a new address, a job record. Proof that Yi did not die, he adapted. The score doesn't swell, it drops out, leaving only the faint rustle of paper. The silence is louder than music could ever be, because silence means realization. And the antagonist's response isn't disbelief, it's immediate calculation. This is where the film's central theme begins to tighten its grip. The idea that survival is not the same as living, and that hiding is only safe until someone decides to hunt. When the antagonist learns Yi is alive, he doesn't go after Yi directly at first. He goes after leverage. He goes after the one part of Yi's life that still contains softness. In that choice, the villain reveals the true shape of his cruelty. He doesn't want a fair fight. He wants Yi to feel helpless the way he felt helpless. He wants to punish Yi for the audacity of continuing to exist. There's a chilling scene where the antagonist sits in a quiet room with his inner circle, and the conversation is delivered with corporate calm. No raised voices, no explicit threats, just language that turns harm into procedure. They discuss risk management, asset protection, loose ends. The film is indicting something broader here, how modern evil often arrives wearing a tie. Speaking in euphemisms, outsourcing pain through layers so no one has to feel responsible. The men in that room don't look like monsters, they look like executives, and that's the point. The monster has evolved. Meanwhile, Yi senses the shift before he can prove it. The film treats Yi's intuition like a sixth sense developed through trauma. He notices things normal people ignore. A car idling too long near his building, a stranger's shoes too polished for the neighborhood, the way someone holds their phone as if waiting for instructions. The camera mirrors his vigilance with tighter framing, longer lenses, shallower depth of field. The background becomes a smear of color, emphasizing that you cannot afford to focus on anything except immediate threat vectors. His world is shrinking to the size of survival. The most heartbreaking part is that Yi's son has no idea. He moves through his day with the casual arrogance of safety, the kind of freedom you only have when you've never been hunted. And Yi watches him like a man watching sunlight through prison bars. There's a scene where the son laughs at something on his phone, and Yi's eyes soften just for a moment before hardening again as a shadow passes across the window. The film holds on Yi's face long enough for you to see the internal conflict, the desire to be simply a father and the necessity of being a shield. It's an emotional contradiction the film keeps returning to without repeating itself. Each time showing a new facet, love as vulnerability, love as fuel, love as the one thing that can force a buried man to rise. When Yi finally confronts the reality that the past has found him, the movie doesn't rush into empowerment. It lingers in the dread of decision. There's a night sequence where Yi sits alone in his car after dropping off a client. Engine off, streetlights flickering above him. The windshield is speckled with rain, turning the city into smeared watercolor. The camera stays close, intimate, and the performance becomes almost unbearably contained. Yi doesn't cry, Yi doesn't rant. He simply breathes slowly, like someone preparing to dive underwater. And then he reaches into the glove compartment and pulls out something that changes the temperature of the entire film, of an old phone, a different kind of device, a relic of the man he used to be. He turns it over in his palm like it's a loaded weapon. The editing around this moment is immaculate. The film intercuts present-day Yi with flashes of his past self, signing deals, shaking hands, smiling for cameras, moving through crowds that parted for him. Those memories don't play like nostalgia, they play like warnings. They remind us that Yi once knew how to be powerful, and that power came with a cost that nearly destroyed him. This is the film's key tension. Vengeance requires returning to a world that already proved it can swallow you whole. To save his son, Yi may have to become the very kind of man he spent 20 years trying not to be. And what makes a conglomerate young Kembali Untuk Balas Dendam feel cinematic rather than merely dramatic is the way it externalizes that internal struggle through space. The city becomes a chessboard again. The camera begins to revisit corporate districts he avoided, glass buildings reflecting him as he walks past, turning him into multiple versions of himself. His framed walking alongside his own reflections like a man haunted by alternate lives. In one shot, he passes a lobby where a younger executive is being photographed, and for a second, a lighting catches Yi's face in a way that makes him look like he belongs there. The moment is brief, almost accidental, and that's why it hits. The film is saying the world never stopped being his, he simply stopped claiming it. The score begins to evolve too. That low pulse from the beginning gains texture, strings that don't quite resolve, a percussive tick that sounds like a watch counting down, occasional piano notes that land and fade like footsteps in an empty corridor. The music never tells you what to feel. It tightens the air around the characters until emotion becomes unavoidable. When Yi watches his son from across the street, the music is barely there, as if even sound is afraid to disturb the fragile normalcy. But when Yi steps into a high-end hotel lobby for the first time in years, the music introduces a subtle motif that feels like an old anthem remembered in a minor key, not triumphant recognition. The film's pacing is confident enough to let scenes breathe. There's an extended sequence where Yi meets someone from his past, an old associate who thought he was dead, and the entire exchange is played like two men negotiating with ghosts. They sit in a quiet tea house, modern yet traditional in design, all clean lines and muted wood. The camera keeps them separated by negative space, emphasizing distance, suspicion, the years between them. The dialogue is carefully written. Nothing is stated directly. Everything is implied. The associate speaks politely, but his eyes keep darting to Yi's hands as if expecting the man to pull a weapon or a contract. Yi speaks softly, but every word lands with the weight of someone who has measured consequences for 2 decades. The scene becomes a jewel made of sentences. And then the film does something that elevates the revenge premise into something more personal. It frames Yi's return not as a sudden switch, but as a gradual rearming of identity. He doesn't put on a suit and instantly become a king. He studies, he listens, he learns what the world has become while he was gone. He discovers which of his enemies grew fat, which allies survived, which institutions shifted. There's a montage, though it's not edited like a typical montage, that shows Yi moving through spaces like a man reacquainting himself with a battlefield, a library of corporate records, a quiet meeting with a journalist, a late-night walk past the old headquarters that now bears someone else's name. Each scene is shot with a sense of reverence and disgust, as if Yi is walking through a museum dedicated to his stolen life. At the center of all of it is the sun, unknowingly pulling Yi forward like gravity. The film keeps giving us small domestic moments to remind us what's at stake. Yi leaving a simple meal in the fridge, Yi repairing something in the apartment without saying much, Yi pausing outside his son's room at night as if listening for danger. These moments are shot with softer light, warmer tones bleeding in at the edges, like the movie is allowing tiny islands of humanity to exist inside an ocean of threat. But even here, tension remains, because the warmth isn't safety, it's what Yi is afraid to lose. When the antagonist finally moves against the sun, the first move is subtle, a job offer that seems too generous, a scholarship, an invitation to an exclusive event, the kind of opportunity that could change a young man's life. Presented like benevolence, the film frames this as psychological warfare. The villain doesn't send thugs first, he sends temptation, because temptation is cleaner, harder to prosecute, easier to deny. There's a brilliantly uncomfortable scene where the son attends a networking event in a luxury venue, and the camera follows him through rooms filled with laughter and clinking glasses. The lighting is bright, but cold, making everyone's skin look slightly porcelain, slightly unreal. Yi isn't there, but the film makes you feel his fear anyway by cutting briefly to him outside, watching from across the street, hidden in plain sight, his face reflected in the tinted window of a parked car. This is where the film's visual storytelling becomes almost suffocating in the best way. Inside the event, the son is surrounded by people yet framed alone. Outside, Yi is physically alone yet surrounded by invisible threats. The parallel is haunting. The son is walking into a world he once ruled, unaware it's also the world that tried to erase his father. And the antagonist's influence is everywhere: logos, donors' names, subtle references in speeches, like a signature scrawled across the city. Then, with a calm cruelty that makes your stomach drop, the film introduces the first direct contact. The son is approached by a well-dressed stranger who knows his name without being told. The stranger speaks with polished friendliness, but the words are too specific, too informed. He mentions Yi in a way that feels casual, like a test. The camera tightens on the son's expression, catching the flicker of confusion, the tiny crack where innocence meets suspicion. Stranger smiles as if he's offering help, but the sound design slips in something faint beneath his voice, an almost inaudible metallic resonance, like the echo of a vault door closing. Outside, Ye watches the interaction through glass, too far to hear, close enough to read body language. The film holds on Ye's eyes as he recognizes the posture, the mannerisms, the subtle choreography of intimidation disguised as conversation. His breathing changes. His hand curls into a fist and then relaxes because he cannot act rashly. If he storms in, he reveals himself. If he does nothing, he risks losing his son to a trap he can already see forming. The score narrows into that familiar low pulse, now joined by a thin, trembling string note that feels like a wire being stretched to its breaking point. And as the sun turns slightly, as if about to look toward the window, toward the street, toward the place where Ye is hiding, the film freezes time with its editing, cutting to a close-up of Ye's face and reflection, his older, quieter self, superimposed over the younger world inside, until you can almost feel the decision rising in him like a tide. Because the past isn't knocking anymore, it's reaching for the one person you can't afford to sacrifice. And the moment the son's gaze drifts closer to the glass, Ye finally steps forward from the shadow, risking everything on a single move that could either save his child or expose him to the hunters waiting to confirm the ghosts is real. There's a particular kind of silence that only exists at the back seat of a stranger's car at 3 a.m, a silence that absorbs neon regret and the low hum of a city that has forgotten your name. Ayah Conglomerate young Kembali Untuk Balas Dendam opens inside that silence, and right from its first frame, the film whispers something most revenge dramas only shout. This is not merely about payback. This is about a man exiled from his own life, quietly orbiting the ruins of an empire he built. Here, on Scenecraft Review, we're stepping into that orbit, into the slow-burning, exquisitely controlled inferno that is Jan's story. A story about a prodigy turned ghost, a father turned driver, and a titan of industry who has to crawl back into the world that tried to erase him. Not for money, not even for justice, but for the one thing that survived the betrayal: his son. The film begins in motion, but emotionally it begins in stillness. We don't see Ye's face immediately, we see what he sees: a rain-streaked light smearing across wet asphalt like memories too blurred to name, the faint reflection of dashboard lights on glass, the distorted red of brake lamps stretching into the distance. The color palette is drenched in deep blues and sickly sodium orange, the kind of colors that feel like insomnia. The camera is nestled in the back seat, slightly off-center, forcing us to watch Ye through the mirror, through fragments, his eyes caught in the rear view, a jawline tightening as a drunk businessman slurs into his phone, the gloved hands that once signed multi-billion-dollar contracts now gripping a steering wheel with quiet, unremarkable focus. The director refuses us the simple catharsis of a clear entrance. Instead, he introduces Ye as an absence in his own frame, a man visible only in reflection, in negative space, in the way other people ignore him. The sound design in this opening stretches that feeling. There's no bombastic score to tell us how to feel. It's all diegetic, wipers squeaking a monotonous rhythm, the faint hiss of the air conditioner, the distant throb of a club bass filtering through closed windows. When the drunk passenger in the back mumbles something about these drivers, they're all failed somethings, right? Ye doesn't respond. He just glances at him once in the rear view, an almost imperceptible flicker of disdain that the camera holds on for a beat too long. That held beat is crucial. It's the film telling us, pay attention to what this man isn't saying. Pay attention to every silence. The entire first scene is built around this tension between what the world thinks he is, just another disposable gig worker, and who he actually was. Used to be a genius of capital whose mind once bent markets around his will. When the film does finally give us a clear look at Yi Hoon Min's face, it does so at the exact moment he is most invisible. The passenger has already stumbled out at a luxury hotel. Barely muttering a thank you, he pulls the car to the side of a dim alley to log out of the app. The neon fades. The engine cuts. For the first time, the city noise recedes into a soft, distant hum. The camera moves from behind his head to a profile, then slowly tracks around to rest on his face in three-quarter view. His eyes are slightly downturned, not in theatrical sadness, but in a kind of habitual inwardness, like someone who has spent 20 years learning how to disappear. The actor plays him with a haunted restraint. Every line on his face feels earned, every micro-expression carrying the echo of boardrooms and betrayals we haven't witnessed yet. In that moment, with the app's earnings tallied quietly glowing on his phone screen, the composer finally lets in a thread of score, a single low piano motif, almost hesitant like a memory daring to return. The film uses that tiny sound as a bridge, slipping us from present to past. Without a title card, without fanfare, the cut comes. The phone's digital numbers dissolve into an old analog clock in an opulent office, its ticking suddenly amplified, each click now the sound of inevitability. The color palette shifts from nocturnal blues to warm, burnished ambers, all polished wood, glass, and gold. This is 20 years earlier, the world before the fall. Here, Yi is framed entirely differently. The camera doesn't spy on him from the back seat. It glides alongside him, almost reverential. He moves through his corporate headquarters with the ease of someone perfectly at home inside power. Assistants fall into step. Board members straighten their ties as he approaches. The cinematography opens up. wide lenses, symmetrical compositions, gleaming skyscraper vistas that scream success. And yet, even in this glow, the film seeds unease in the details, the way the glass walls reflect his image multiple times, splitting him into duplicates, the way the background is always just a bit overexposed, as if this brightness could flare out and erase him at any second. What's remarkable is how the actor modulates Yi's physicality between timelines. In the past, Yi stands slightly forward on the balls of his feet, his gestures precise, his gaze direct and assessing. In the present, his shoulders slope just a degree more, his steps are quieter, his gaze spends more time on the floor or on the road, but the eyes are the anchor. In both timelines, there is the same cold analytical intelligence, the same habit of measuring people, of constructing and deconstructing strategies in real time. The difference is that in the past, that intelligence is recognized and rewarded. In the present, it is caged behind a steering wheel and a cheap synthetic car seat cover. The film's underlying cruelty emerges in this contrast. The system that once exalted his mind has not only cast him out, it has reclassified him as functionally invisible. And that, of course, is where revenge stories are born. The prologue to the betrayal is masterfully staged as a board meeting that looks at first glance like any climax of corporate triumph. The camera cranes slowly over a massive polished table, the reflections of suits and leather chairs gliding over its surface. A screen displays rising graphs, multinational expansion maps, numbers that might as well be war casualty figures, except they're colored emerald green. The score shifts into a sleek, low electronic pulse, mimicking the hum of servers and trading floors. Yi presents a plan, his voice confident, but not ostentatious. He is not the wolf of anything. He is a tactician. We see in carefully framed reaction shots how various board members respond. Some eyes gleam with ambition, others with calculation. One man in particular, seated to Yi's right, is framed with particular emphasis, Liang Shanhao, the eventual antagonist. The director plants him in the mise-en-scene like a benign shadow at first, polite, supportive, nodding at all the right points. He even finishes one of Yi's sentences, which earns a small chuckle from the room. It is the intimacy of longtime allies. It is also the first hairline crack. The screenplay is not interested in giving us a simplistic villain. Liang is not introduced with ominous music or sinister close-ups. Instead, his menace comes from how ordinary his smile is, how seamlessly he blends into the corporate choreography. When the betrayal finally comes later, its horror is not that a snake was hiding in the grass, but that the boardroom itself was always a nest of snakes, and Ye thought he had tamed them. That's the thematic knife the film keeps twisting. Intelligence doesn't equal immunity. You can be the smartest man in the room and still misread the one thing that matters: loyalty. Back in the present, the film lingers with Ye's routine as a replacement driver much longer than typical revenge thrillers would allow. It understands that to feel the weight of his comeback, we have to feel the texture of the life he settled into. We see him napping in his car in an underground parking lot at dawn, condensation fogging up the windshield as the city above begins its day without him. We watch him eat cheap box meals on the hood of his vehicle, the plastic fork bending slightly, the steam curling up and catching the faint early morning light. The camera often floats just outside the car, looking in through glass, making us acutely aware of the barrier between his interior world and the environment rushing past. The sound mix emphasizes that division. Inside the car, sounds are soft, insulated, turn signal clicks, fabric rustle, his quiet breathing. Outside, when a window rolls down, the noise slams in. Honks, construction, street vendors calling out, fragments of pop music blaring from nearby scooters. Each client he picks up is like a ghost from a life he no longer lives. Young entrepreneurs bragging loudly about seed funding, mid-level managers complaining about idiot bosses, wealthy socialites scrolling through gossip about the very conglomerate he once led, unaware that their driver designed some of the supply chains for the bags they carry. There is an exquisite cruelty in one of these early fares. A brash 20-something in a tailored but slightly ill-fitting suit climbs in, barking into his phone about an upcoming pitch to Liang Holdings. Every time he says the name Liang, there is the slightest flinch in Ye's hand on the gish shift, a tension in the jaw. The film doesn't cut away to a flashback. It resists the urge to interject the past. Instead, it makes us sit in that suffocating present where someone casually name-drops the man who destroyed you like he's just another corporate idol. The young man trying to impress the person on the other end of the line calls Liang a visionary, a legend, built his empire out of nothing. There is a tiny, almost invisible moment where Ye's eyes meet the young man's reflection in the review, and something like bitter amusement flickers across his face. The world has rewritten history, and the author of its opening chapters has been edited out. This idea of erasure, of being written out of your own story, runs throughout the film's visual language. Mirrors, glass, and screens constantly interpose us between Ye and I. In the office flashbacks, he persists as a doubled figure in reflective surfaces, multiplied and monumental. In the present, he's often partially obscured by headrests, by steering wheels, by windshield glare that almost washes him out. The lighting often leaves his face half in shadow, half in the sick glow of his phone, as if the world now only recognizes him as a profile picture in a driver app database. The director leans into this motif during a quiet, almost mundane scene where Yi goes to a small, late-night convenience store. He stands by the refrigerator section, picking out a single can of cheap coffee. The camera tracks his reflection across the glass doors, distorted, broken by the metal frames. The fluorescent lights above flicker slightly, buzzing with that flat supermarket hum. It's a banal moment, but it sets up something vital. This is a man who has accepted fragmentation as his default state. He moves through these fractured reflections without protest. He believes he deserves, or at least must endure, this half-existence. And that's where the sun comes in. Because if the film was just about a disgraced mogul ploddingly climbing back to the top, it would be interesting but familiar. What sharpens it into something bracing is the slow, painful revelation that Yi's exile isn't just self-imposed. It's intertwined with his decision to stay away from his child. The first time the film mentions the son, it's almost an afterthought. Yi sits in his modest room above a garage, a narrow, utilitarian space with a single bed, a small table, and a wall covered not with family photos, but with old, yellowing financial clippings, like a private mausoleum to his former life. On that table lies an old featured smartphone, distinct from the cheap one he uses for the driver app. The screen is cracked, the battery clearly swelling. He picks it up, hesitates, then powers it on. The UI is outdated. The boot-up chime sounds nostalgic, almost ghostly. There is a brief shot of a single contact pinned at the top of the messaging app. June. No last name, just that. The last message is dated years ago, a short, polite sentence checking if he's doing well. It has no reply. The camera lingers on that unanswered message. The music doesn't swell. Instead, the room's ambient sounds, distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere, the faint electrical hum of a faulty bulb grow louder, as if the silence between father and son is filling the frame. Yi's thumb hovers over the keyboard. Slowly, he types a single word, sorry. He stares at it, his breathing shallow. The word sits there, an accusation and a confession. Then, with a barely audible exhale, he deletes it, locks the phone, and places it face down. In that simple action, the film encapsulates 20 years of guilt, of distance, of a man who might be capable of restructuring entire industries, but cannot find the courage to send one message to his son. Our introduction to June himself comes not through some melodramatic reunion, but through a completely different visual and tonal register. After a hard cut, we're in a university campus bathed in soft morning light. The color palette shifts to greens and pale golds, the air almost hazy with youth and possibility. The camera follows a group of students from behind as they walk, backpacks slung low, trading jokes about exams and internships. Among them, slightly apart but clearly the center of gravity, is June. He's not introduced as Jan by name. Instead, we meet him as his own character. He's dressed better than most of his friends. Nothing ostentatious, but there's a subtle polish to his clothes, a brand of watch that suggests some level of financial comfort. He laughs easily, but there is a certain reservedness when the conversation turns to families. When a friend complains about his strict father, everyone chimes in with their own stories, except June, who cracks a joke about being raised by spreadsheets and scholarship brochures instead. It prompts laughter, but the camera holds on his face a fraction of a second longer than on the others, just long enough for us to see the fleeting shadow behind the punchline. The film is careful not to make John a cliché, angry son abandoned by his father from moment one. Instead, he's competent, driven, and ironically, fascinated by business. In a lecture hall scene, we see him challenging a professor's take on a famous corporate turnaround story. The professor romanticizes the CEO's visionary leadership, but John notes a buried line in the case study about mass layoffs and long-term harm to local communities. At what point does a successful turnaround stop being genius and start being something else, he asks. The classroom murmurs. The professor gives a diplomatically evasive answer. That line isn't just thematic foreshadowing about his father. It also positions John as someone trying to navigate the moral fog of the same world that destroyed Yi. He's inside the machine, but he can see some of the gears grinding people up. We later learn through a conversation between John and his mother over a video call that his official story of his father is simple. He died in an accident when John was very young. There are no photos in his dorm room, no heirlooms, just the quiet gap of a missing narrative. The mother's face appears on screen, framed by a small, tidy apartment. The lighting warm but slightly dim, suggesting a life of careful frugality. Her kindness is evident, but so is tiredness. When Jan mentions an internship opportunity with Lean Group, there's the tiniest pause on her end, a micro-freeze, a flicker of something like distaste. She quickly recovers, masking it with a practical question about salary. The script trusts us here. It doesn't underline her reaction with music or explanation. It just plants that small dissonance. The name Liang causes a ripple that no one acknowledges aloud. Parallel to Jan's rising trajectory, the film deepens its portrayal of Ye's stasis. There's a sequence where he drives out to the city's fringes, dropping off a client near an industrial area. Instead of turning back immediately, he pulls over beside a long-abandoned construction site. Vast concrete pillars rise like broken teeth against the gray sky. Rebar jutting out, rusted and skeletal. The wind whistles softly through incomplete walls. Ye steps out of the car and walks through this half-built ruin. The camera tracks him from a distance at first, making him look small against the failed monument. We slowly realize through bits of graffiti-covered signage and a faded, peeling logo on a tarp that this was once one of his own projects. A grand mixed-use development that was never completed after his disappearance. The imagery is almost too on the nose, but the direction is so controlled it transcends blunt symbolism. This husk of ambition is not just a metaphor for his derailed life. It's also a physical reminder that his absence reshaped the city itself. Concrete and steel still bear his ghost. Inside the skeletal structure, he finds an old mud-caked safety helmet with the company's former name embossed on it. He runs his fingers over the letters, his touch tender, almost apologetic. The camera moves into a close-up of his hand, a working man's hand, now rough, slightly calloused from long hours of driving, but still with the remnants of an executive's manicure. Nails trimmed with habitual precision. His fingers tremble, almost imperceptibly. and that trembling carries more emotional weight than any outburst could. In a lesser film, this would be the moment of loud declaration, "I'm coming back." Instead, he simply places the helmet back down, sits on a concrete block, and stares out at the empty lot where future skyscrapers were once imagined. The score introduces a subtle motif of distant electronic chimes over a low string drone, evoking the ghost of past progress. The question the film keeps asking in these early stretches is deceptively simple. What keeps a man like this in exile? Why hasn't he, in 20 years, attempted to reclaim anything? There's a line later that offers a hint, delivered almost casually. During a late-night ride, Ye picks up a middle-aged woman who clearly recognizes him. She stares at him in the rear view for a long, uncomfortable moment before saying, "You look like someone I used to know." Ye's body stiffens. His grip on the wheel tightens. The camera inches closer, but doesn't give us a full reaction shot. She fumbles for the name, Ye Han something. He calmly replies that she must be mistaken, that he just has one of those faces. But the tension in the car is thick. As she leaves, she half turns back and says, "If you are him, staying alive is sometimes the cruelest revenge you can take, you know?" He doesn't respond. The door shuts. The line hangs in the air. It's a pointed suggestion that his survival itself is in some way a middle finger to the narrative his enemies tried to write. Yet his refusal to engage, to reveal, suggests another layer: shame, fear, and perhaps a promise made long ago to stay gone for someone's sake. When the film finally takes us to the actual scene of betrayal, it does so not as a mystery reveal, but as a traumatic memory triggered by an almost trivial present detail. Ye is cleaning his car windshield in a gas station, watching the neon reflection of the fuel price display shimmer across the wet glass. The way the red digits fracture and run suddenly cuts us to a memory of red numbers on a stock ticker plunging. The sound design slams in with the frantic clacking of keyboards, phone rings, overlapping shouts. We're back in that golden amber office tower, except now the color has shifted to a harsher, sickly yellow, and the camera is handheld, restless, mimicking the instability of the moment. Markets are crashing. A hostile takeover rumor is spreading. Yin is at the center of the storm, giving crisp orders, rerouting funds, trying to keep the ship from capsizing. What's brilliantly cruel is that the betrayal isn't a dramatic, villainous stab in the back at the height of his power. It happens precisely when he is most vulnerable, fighting to save the company, perhaps even his employees' livelihoods. Liang and a small inner circle of board members appear at first as allies, rallying to his side. The score drops into near silence as they usher him into a private conference room, away from the chaos. The door closes with a soft click that sounds in the mix ominously final. Inside, the lighting is colder, the walls barer, the table smaller. The composition tightens, hemming in. The camera shifts to a shallow depth of field that keeps his face sharp while the others blur, emphasizing his isolation even among supposed friends. Liang's betrayal unfolds with terrifying politeness. He slides a folder across the table, his hand steady, his tone measured. The folder contains evidence of Yin's alleged financial misconduct, partly fabricated, partly twisted from real but morally ambiguous decisions made under pressure. There's talk of regulators, of prosecutors, of public scapegoats. Liang frames it as inevitability. They need someone's head. If it's not yours, it will be all of ours. And between you and the company, he trails off, letting the implication complete itself in Yin's mind. The power play is as much psychological as legal. They are not just stealing his empire. They are trying to convince him that offering up his own ruin is an act of noble sacrifice. The actor's performance in this scene is devastatingly restrained. Yin listens, eyes scanning the documents, lips thinning. He asks pointed questions, trying to find the angle, the leverage, the escape route. But with each carefully worded response from Liang, each fainted expression of regret from the others, the walls close in. The camera inches closer, the focal length increasing subtly, distorting the edges of the frame. We begin to feel his vertigo. There's a moment where he reaches for a glass of water and his hand shakes so slightly it might be missed. The sound of his swallow is amplified in the mix, echoing like a man trying to gulp down the fact of his own erasure. What seals the betrayal is not the legal trap, but the invocation of his family. Liang let slip too casually to be an accident that regulators won't just dig into corporate accounts, they'll dig into every aspect of your life, your wife, your little boy. The two words little boys hit like a gunshot in the silence. For the first time, Yin's facade cracks. He stands, chair scraping harshly against the floor. The camera cuts to a close-up of his eyes, not wide with fear, but narrowing with a kind of animal calculation. This is the fulcrum of the film, the moments where a father's instinct and a tycoon's pride collide. In that split second, you can see him running scenarios in his head. Fight and drag his family through a public spectacle, flee, and forsake everything he has built. The scene doesn't show us the full negotiation, the signatures, the exit. It cuts instead from his clenched jaw in that room to the quiet, emptied-out parking garage of the present, where he stands alone, squeegee in hand. The neon numbers of the gas station signs still shimmering in the wet glass. The past and present bleed into each other, united by that same look in his eyes, the look of a man who chose disappearance as a shield. This is the weight that hovers over every present-day scene with him. He isn't just bitter, he's complicit in his own vanishing, and he knows it. That awareness curdles into self-loathing, which in turn feeds his distance from June. The film never reduces him to a martyr. He is in many ways a coward when it comes to fatherhood, and the story refuses to let him off the hook. That refusal gives the eventual stakes of the revenge arc something much sharper than the usual "you hurt my family" trope. It's not that the villains are threatening a perfect home. They are threatening the one fragile chance he has left to maybe finally stop running from the people he failed. The mechanism by which his enemies discover he is still alive is rooted in that modern, seemingly mundane surveillance capitalism that the film subtly critiques throughout. It happens because of data, not dramatic sightings. We get a sequence intercutting Yi's nighttime drives with the sterile glow of a corporate security operations center inside Liang Group's headquarters. Banks of monitors, analysts in headsets, the soft clatter of keyboards. This is a different kind of battlefield now, one fought with algorithms and pattern recognition. An internal investigation into leaked trade routes happens to flag a familiar name buried in a third-party contractor list, the small ride-hailing subcontractor that employs Yi. A junior analyst runs a secondary search, cross-references driver registry photos with old archived press images from 2 decades ago. Software traces the bone structure similarities, spits out a probability score. The analysts treat it like a curiosity at first. "Hey, doesn't this guy look like that dead mogul?" They laugh. One of them forwards it up the chain anyway, just in case. The way the film frames this discovery is chilling. We are not in a smoky back room with conspirators. We're in an air-conditioned, fluorescent-lit data center. The camera glides past cold server racks, the sound design thick with white noise and low fans, as if we're inside a digital brain, dreaming in ones and zeros. The analyst's cursor hovers over the send button. She hesitates a fraction of a second, then clicks. It's such a simple gesture, but the edit slams us back into Yi's world at the exact instant the email whooshes off. Yi is at an intersection, the pedestrian light blinking red, his turn signal ticking. The cross-cutting suggests a cruel parallel, the same rhythmic blinking, the same tiny everyday decision points, but one carries the weight of narrative rupture. The other is just another stop on a long shift. He has no idea that somewhere in a glass tower, an algorithm has just resurrected him in the eyes of his enemies. When the information finally reaches Liang, it does so in a conference room, bathed in cold white light, midway through a strategy meeting about an upcoming merger. The scene is shot with an almost Kubrickinian detachment at first, wide shots, symmetrical framing, executives positioned like pieces on a board. A secretary quietly enters, leans down, and whispers into Liang's ear, placing a tablet in front of him. The conversation around the table continues, full of buzzwords and synergy cliches, but the soundtrack narrows to just the sound of Liang's own breathing as he swipes through the photos. The camera moves in, isolating him in the frame, the others blurring into unimportant background noise. On the tablet, we see the mugshot-like photo of Yi from the driver registry, then an old newspaper clipping of Yi at a charity gala, smiling for cameras. The years have thickened his features, carved deeper lines, but the algorithm is right. It's him. Liang's reaction is not a cartoonish outburst. Instead, his face goes very still. There's a slow exhale, the barely perceptible tightening of lips, a flicker of something like irritation, quickly masked by composure. He thanks the secretary in a neutral tone and dismisses her. When an executive asks for his opinion on the last slide, he responds flawlessly, even adding a small joke that makes the room chuckle. It's only after the meeting that the mask cracks slightly. Alone in his office, framed against a cityscape of towers that bear his name, he reopens the photos. The score introduces a faint, dissonant violin line under a bed of low electronic rumble. Liang taps the photo as if testing its reality. "You should have stayed dead," he murmurs, not with rage, but with weary annoyance, like someone discovering a long-forgotten problem he'd thought he'd already solved. What haunts Liang is not just the possibility of exposure, it's the return of an old mirror. Everything he has become in the last 20 years, every award, every magazine cover, every philanthropic foundation, has been built over the grave of Yi's reputation. He has been, in effect, living in a house constructed from another man's bones. The film hints at a complex psychology here. Liang is not merely threatened, he is offended. How dare this ghost refuse to remain buried? How dare the original architect of the empire show up now as a driver, of all things, with the power to potentially unravel the myth of Liang's self-made legacy? The plan to deal with Yi when it emerges is chilling precisely because it doesn't go straight to murder. The first instinct is containment. Liang convenes a small inner circle late at night. No big table this time, just a dimly lit private bar with dark wood and amber liquor. The atmosphere is convivial on the surface, but the camera's tight framing on hands, eyes, and the way the light caresses the sweat on glasses tells us everything. Their language is coded. They talk about legacy risks, narrative control, dormant liabilities. Yi is not a human being to them anymore. He's a data point that has unexpectedly reappeared on a chart, a spike on an otherwise smooth line. One of them suggests a payoff, a quiet settlement. Another points out that the paper trail of the old scandal is too dangerous to disturb. Liang listens, silent, sipping his drink. Finally, he sets the glass down with a soft clink that lands in the mix like a gavel. "We don't touch him," he says, voice almost gentle. "We touch what keeps him alive." The ambiguity in that line is deliberate. At first, we might think he means money, livelihood. But as they discuss further, one of the executives, icy, practical, with a background in private intelligence, mentions a small investigative bit of data from those long-ago days. He had a son, didn't he? About 3 or 4 when everything went down. The wife's divorced quietly after his death, moved away. Kid would be in his early 20s now. There's a pause. Liang's gaze drifts to the window out over the city. The camera moves with it, panning across the glittering skyline, the very urban expanse reshaped by their shared past. "Find him," Liang says softly. "Sometimes the ghost doesn't matter. The ghost's shadow does." This shift from targeting Ye directly to targeting his son is where the film's moral horror crystallizes. It's no longer about cleaning up old corporate messes. It's about weaponizing the one part of Ye's life he tried to keep untouched, albeit through absence. For Liang, who once used Ye's paternal love as leverage to force his exile, this is simply a continuation of the same tactic, the family as pressure point, as bargaining chip. The cinematography underscores this transition with a series of parallel cuts. As Liang's team begins to pull up data on possible sons of Yen, university records, birth certificates, scholarship lists, the film flips back to Jun, blissfully unaware, rehearsing a presentation for a major internship recruitment event. The music rides a thin line between hopeful and ominous, a repeated arpeggio that sounds both like progress and like a warning siren muffled behind a wall. Jun's introduction to Liang's corporate world is one of the film's most visually striking set pieces. The recruitment event is held in a vast glass-walled atrium that feels more like a cathedral than an office lobby. Sunlight floods in, refracted through steel beams, casting long lines of shadow across polished floors. Massive LED screens play highlight reels of Liang Group's achievements, gleaming factories, smiling workers, lush environmental initiatives that might or might not be greenwashing. The color palette for this environment is crisp whites, metallic silvers, and carefully curated greenery, a sterile utopia of capitalism at its most seductive. Students mill about in suits and blouses slightly too new, clutching resumes like passports. Jun moves through this space with a mix of awe and critical distance. The camera often lags just half a step behind him, making us aware of the way he's being enveloped by this architecture of aspiration. His eyes are bright, but they also dart to details others might miss. The security cameras tucked discreetly into ceiling corners, the small print disclaimers on the promotional panels. He delivers his pitch to a panel of HR representatives with poise and substance, not shy about asking pointed questions about corporate responsibility and long-term community impact. One of the executives raises an eyebrow at his audacity, but another smiles, impressed. To them, he's a promising young talent. To us, he's walking into the lion's mouth. As Jen waits near the refreshment area afterward, sipping bad coffee from a paper cup, the camera shifts to a high-angle shot from the perspective of one of those security cameras. On a nearby monitor in a darkened control room, an operator zooms in, guided by a name tag, cross-referencing with a file on their screen. The cursor hovers over Ye Jun. A match is confirmed. The operator's voice crackles softly through a headset to some unseen superior. The whole sequence is shot with a clinical detachment that makes it even more skin-crawling. There's no dramatic sting, no sudden shift in lighting, just a bureaucratic process ticking forward. Another form to be filed. The terror comes from how impersonal it is. Parallel to this unfolding threat, the film continues to trap Ye in his cocoon of ignorance for as long as possible, building a tight coil of dread for the audience. We, the viewers, now know what Liang knows. We've seen Jun being identified, flags quietly marked. Ye hasn't. He's still rattling along the city's roads, so used to being unseen that he doesn't feel the gaze turning back toward him yet. The editing leans into this dramatic irony. In one sequence, Ye's car drives past the Liang Group building just as Jun is inside, stepping into an elevator after the event. The two are infinitesimally close, separated by a matter of meters and inches of glass, but also by 2 decades of lies and distance. The camera cuts from Ye's expressionless face behind the windshield to Jun's nervous, excited profile reflected in the elevator's polished interior. Both are contained by transparent boxes, moving along prescribed trajectories neither fully controls. The first real collision between their worlds doesn't come in a meet-cute or a sudden revelation. It comes in a near accident. Late one night, Ye is called to a higher-end district he rarely services, lured by surge pricing. The streets are wide, lined with trees, the air oddly still. As he navigates a quiet intersection, his headlights pick up a figure stepping off the curb, face half buried in a phone, earbuds in. The sudden screech of brakes slices through the night, tires burning a thin line of rubber on asphalt. The score drops away completely. For a heartbeat, the only sound is the frantic panting of both men, driver and pedestrian, separated by a thin layer of metal and glass. The camera goes subjectively into Ye's point of view for a moment, the edges of the frame blurring as adrenaline surges. The person in front of the car freezes, hands splayed on the hood. It's June, of course, older now than any memory Ye has of his son. The streetlights cast a soft halo around his hair, making him look, in this split second, almost ethereal, an apparition conjured by guilt. Ye's eyes widen, and the film finally allows itself a flash of overt emotional reaction, a gasp, half-formed, torn between shock and an instinct he doesn't fully understand yet. He doesn't know this is his son. He has no conscious reason to. And yet, there's a weird flickering recognition that plays across his features, like the body remembering something the mind has chosen to forget. June yanks off one earbud, anger flaring to mask his fear. He strides toward the driver's side, knocking on the window with more force than necessary. "Are you blind?" he snaps, his voice cracking slightly. Inside the car, Ye fumbles for the window control, hands still trembling from the near miss. As the glass slides down, their faces finally share the same air. The camera cuts to an extreme close-up of Ye's eyes, tiny involuntary micro-movements scanning June's face, absorbing details, the shape of the nose, the line of the jaw, the way the eyes crinkle at the outer corners in the exact way his wife's once did. Time seems to thicken. The soundscape warps, street noise stretching out, a low, distorted hum rising. June demands an apology, righteously indignant. His words are sharp, but he's not cruel, not really. Ye stammers something, an apology, an admission of fault, but his voice sounds far away, like it's coming from someone else. The acting here is extraordinary. In those few seconds, we see a man realizing, without quite realizing, that fate has just shoved the one person he has spent 20 years avoiding directly into his path. The script smartly avoids any overt hint of recognition on June's part. To him, this is just an irresponsible older driver. He doesn't know he's yelling at the father he thinks is buried in some unmarked grave of scandal and shame. The scene ends without climax. June, after a last frustrated glance, steps back, mutters, "Watch the road next time," and walks away into the night, his shoulders still tense. Ye watches him recede in the rearview mirror, a small figure swallowed by darkness and distance. The score creeps back in, a low, pulsing bass under a fragile piano motif that barely holds itself together. Ye's hands remain frozen on the wheel, long after the light turns green. A horn blares from behind. Someone yells for him to move. He jerks mechanically, shifts into drive, but his gaze keeps flicking back to where June disappeared, like a needle stuck on an old record groove. From this moment on, the film's emotional temperature subtly shifts. Ye is no longer just coasting in numb survival mode. Something has been stirred, something raw and hungry and terrified. He tries to compartmentalize, to shove that moment into the same mental vault where he locked away boardrooms and family photos. But unlike those buried memories, this one lives in the same city, walks the same streets, breathes the same air. He starts noticing young men of June's age everywhere, on scooters, in cafe windows, laughing in clusters on sidewalks. Each one is briefly, irrationally, almost his son. The cinematography leans into this, blurring backgrounds, sharpening faces that resemble June for a split second before resolving into strangers. The world becomes a hall of almost mirrors. Meanwhile, Liang's examinations tighten. His team confirms Jun's identity, maps out his routine with chilling efficiency: class schedules, dorm location, part-time tutoring gig, weekly calls to his mother. Their language around him is purely logistical, devoid of humanity. Asset proximity, pressure scenarios, contingent leverage. The film doesn't yet reveal the exact nature of their plan, only that it involves orchestrating a crisis around Jun that can be spun as an unfortunate accident with plausible deniability baked into each step. This ambiguity is deeply unsettling because it turns every ordinary hazard of city life, crosswalks, late-night buses, dodgy construction scaffolding, into potential instruments of corporate violence. The sequence that finally forces Yi to confront the intersection of his old enemies and his new fragile connection to Jun is one of the tensest in the film. And it starts with something as simple as a notification ping. Late at night, parked on a quiet overlook road with the city sprawled in indifferent lights below, Yi rummages in his glove compartment for a pack of stale cigarettes, an old habit resurrected under stress. Out tumbles the cracked older phone, the one with Jun's unanswered message. It powers on accidentally as it hits the seat, the screen flaring weakly. A string of system notifications scrolls by. Missed software updates, storage warnings. Then, unexpectedly, a small banner appears. New tagged photo. Yan Yi was mentioned in a post. Yi's breath catches. His thumb hovers, almost afraid to touch the screen, as if the mere act of opening that world might shatter whatever precarious equilibrium he's clung to. When he does tap it, the film shifts visual style slightly, adopting the vertical framing of a social media feed. We see a recent photo of Jun at the Liang Group recruitment event, smiling with other candidates in front of the corporate logo. The post's caption burbles with excitement about future leaders and once-in-a-lifetime internships. To Yi, the logo is not just a brand. It's the crest of the family that devoured his own. The image of his son, older, taller, more self-possessed than any memory he consciously allows himself to recall, standing in front of the Liang sigil, hits him like a physical blow. The camera cuts to his face again, capturing a flash of pure, undiluted panic before he shoves it down. In the next breath, the feed updates with a short clip someone has tagged from the same event, Jun asking his thoughtful, slightly confrontational question about corporate morality. His voice comes through the tiny speakers, a bit tinny but clear. Yi hears for the first time in 2 decades the cadence of his son's speech, familiar yet unfamiliar, a child's timbre stretched into a man's. There is a devastating reaction shot where Yi instinctively reaches out, fingers brushing the screen as if he could touch the sound itself. The film drops all music, letting Jun's voice echo in the cramped car interior like a ghost giving a lecture on ethics to the father who failed him. This is the pivot. For 20 years, Yi has survived by convincing himself that staying away was an act of protection. But now that illusion collapses. His son is not tucked away in some safe, ordinary life, is walking straight into the open jaws of the man who once used him as leverage. The line between exile as shield and exile as abdication becomes painfully clear. The cinematography reflects this internal rupture by throwing his face into high-contrast chiaroscuro, half his features lost in shadow, the other half overexposed by the cold phone light. It's as if he's being split on screen between the man he became and the man he once was, both finally forced to look at the consequence of their choices. When the film cuts away from that image, it does so not into a flurry of immediate action, but into an almost unbearable stillness. Yi drives aimlessly at first, the city flowing around him like water. His hands on the wheel are steady now, but there's a new deliberateness to his gaze. The camera settles into a tight shot from the dashboard, watching him in 3/4 profile as neon reflections slide up and down his face like prison bars. The score returns with a low, insistent rhythmic motif, something between a heartbeat and a ticking clock. For the first time since the opening, his eyes are not simply scanning for passengers or traffic. They're looking beyond into some invisible horizon where boardrooms and car interiors collide. There's a crucial wordless sequence that follows. Instead of going back to his room above the garage, he drives toward the old financial district. The streets here are emptier at this hour, the skyscrapers mostly dark except for a few late-night lights in upper floors. He parks in front of a building that used to be his headquarters, now renamed under Liang's brand. The camera stays outside as he steps out of the car, making him small against the towering glass facade. He walks to the entrance, stops short of the bright pool of light cast by the lobby. Through the glass, we see the polished marble, the receptionist's empty desk, the company logo gleaming on the far wall. He doesn't go inside. Instead, he stands at the threshold, separated by a few centimeters of glass and 20 years of history. The reflection on that glass is perhaps the most loaded image so far. In it, Yek's present-day figure overlaps just so with the faint spectral remnants of his younger self we've seen in flashbacks. It's not a literal superimposition, but the framing suggests it. The same shoulders, now more stooped. The same jaw, now more squared by age. The same eyes, now carrying a universe more hurt. The lighting catches the faint mist of his breath on the glass, slowly fading, appearing, fading, like the ghost of resolve forming and dissolving. He lifts a hand as if to touch the logo, then stops halfway, fingers curling into a fist. It's such a simple motion, but it feels like a tectonic shift. This is a man who has spent 2 decades refusing to cross this line. Now, with his son's face burned into his retinas beside that logo, the line feels less like safety and more like cowardice. The film doesn't give us his decision in words. It trusts that we can read it in that clenched fist, in the tightened lines of his face as he turns away from the building, not in defeat this time, but in grim preparation. He walks back to his car with a different gait, heavier, but also more purposeful. The camera tracks him from behind, close enough that we can hear the small creaks of his joints, the soft swish of fabric. As he opens the driver's door, he pauses, looks up at the building one last time, and in a barely audible whisper, says something like an oath. Not to Liang, not even to the company, but to himself and to the son who doesn't know his name. The words are too soft to catch, swallowed by the distant wind, but the emotion is not. From that moment, something in the film's rhythm changes. Scenes start to cut slightly faster, the score's tempo edging up just a touch, subtle enough that you might only feel it in your pulse. The narrative energy shifts from observation to incipient action. The man who has spent half the film trying not to be noticed is beginning, very cautiously, to step back into visibility. But the haunting question that hangs over every frame now is this: can someone who has built their entire survival mechanism around disappearance survive being seen again? And more terrifyingly, what happens when the first people who notice are not his son, not allies, but the very predators who once fed on his fall? As if to deepen that dread, the film cuts away from Yek's tar to an interior shot high up in that same building, on a floor that still hums with light at this late hour. In Liang's private office, the city glows beneath floor-to-ceiling windows, but the man himself stands in half-shadow, his face lit only by the bluish light of a tablet. On the screen, paused mid-frame, is the social media clip of Jun at the recruitment event, his question hanging in the air, eyebrows slightly raised with that mix of humility and challenge. Liang replays the moment several times, not focusing on the content of the question, but on Jun's face. The camera holds on Liang's expression as it cycles through unreadable shifts: curiosity, mild admiration, a flash of something like regret, immediately masked by calculation. He taps the screen to zoom in slightly, bringing Jun's features into sharper relief. "You have your father's eyes," he murmurs, almost to himself. The way he says it is not sentimental. It's almost diagnostic, as if noting a genetic similarity to some inherited disease. The score underlines the line not with melodrama, but with a barely there tremor in the strings, like a vibration you feel more than hear. That single observation ties together all the strands the film has been weaving: genes, legacy, the way sins and gifts transmit across generations, whether we want them to or not. Then, very calmly, almost wearily, Liang picks up his phone and makes a call. We don't hear the other side of the conversation. The camera stays tight on his face, letting us read the intent purely in his tone and micro-expressions. "The son," he says, "keep him close. Make sure he feels chosen. These ambitious ones, they'll walk themselves to the edge if you shine the right light on the path." He pauses, eyes flicking briefly toward the dark city beyond the glass. "And as for the father, he'll come out of hiding soon enough. Ghosts always do when you cast their shadows onto a cliff." The cut back down to the street is abrupt, almost jarring. A bus roars by, splashing dirty water on the curb. A stray dog noses through a pile of trash. The camera drifts until it finds Yi's car again, parked under a flickering street lamp, that flicker carving his silhouette into discrete moments of presence and absence. The engine is off. Inside, he sits in the driver's seat, hands not on the wheel this time, but folded tightly in his lap like someone bracing for impact. He has no idea that somewhere above, a man is already scripting not just his future, but his son's. The film holds on this image for a heartbeat longer than seems comfortable. The lamp buzzes, flickers, buzzes again. In that intermittent light, the contours of his face seem to change. Sometimes the weary driver, sometimes the sharp-eyed strategist of 20 years ago. It's in this tremulous, suspended space between who he was and who he is being forced to become again, with predators circling above and an unsuspecting son moving ever closer to the center of their net, that the movie pauses, just for a moment, as if drawing a long breath before the inevitable collision of all these trajectories. From that suspended breath, the film exhales into a second movement that feels like a man relearning how to inhabit his own body, his own mind, his own capacity for disruption. The first sign that something has shifted inside Yi is not a big declaration, but a tiny act of defiance. He disables the auto-accept feature on his driver app. For the first time in years, he wants control over where he goes. It's a small digital click, but thematically, it's him reclaiming agency in a life that has been stuck on autopilot. The shot of his finger hovering over that setting is lit almost reverently by the cold glow of the phone, and when he presses it, the score needles in a faint new motif, a subtle rhythmic tattoo on muted percussion that feels like a distant war drum finally being heard. What follows is a series of nights in which he quietly, methodically redraws his own map of the city. Instead of chasing the hottest demand zones, he orbits around the places where June exists without knowing he's being watched. The university gates, the ramen shop where he studies late, the cheap gym where he boxes in the evenings, the bus stop near his modest student housing. The camera switches to longer lenses, compressing the distance between Yi in his parked car and June in these slices of life, making them appear closer than they would to the naked eye. It's a visual expression of the tension between proximity and separation, father and son occupying the same frame but different worlds. There's a queasy intimacy to these sequences. The film knows it's dancing on the line between love and surveillance. Yi sits in darkness, engine off, watching June laugh with friends, watching him slump in exhaustion over textbooks, watching him lean against a street lamp as he waits for a rideshare at midnight. Sometimes he almost starts the car to leave when he sees June stumble out of a bar, giddy and tipsy, but he doesn't. Other times, he inches his car forward, offering himself up as the nearest available driver, only to freeze when the app pings and displays June's name. The first time that happens, the tension is unbearable. His thumb trembles over the accept button. He declines, breath ragged, as another driver icon swoops in on the map and carries his son away. It's an act of cowardice, born of love, and the film refuses to judge him. It just lets the camera linger on his hand as it slowly unclenches. But while he hesitates, Liang accelerates. The internship offer arrives with almost theatrical benevolence. An email followed by a phone call, then a formal letter embossed with Liang Group's crest. The scene where John receives it is soaked in that peculiar brightness of newly offered futures. He stands at his dorm room window, the city lights twinkling behind him as he stares at the letterhead. The soundtrack becomes airy, almost hopeful, soft chords that in another film would underscore a coming-of-age triumph. He calls his mother, voice quivering with a mixture of pride and disbelief. On the small screen of his phone, her face tightens into an expression that is half joy, half a very old fear resurfacing. She congratulates him, of course. She tells him he deserves it. But after the call ends, the camera lingers on her alone in her kitchen, the light harsh on the worn linoleum, her tea growing cold. She retrieves an old clippings box from the back of a cupboard, its edges frayed, its corners bent. Inside are yellowed articles about Yi's scandal, folded in half, the headlines hidden, but the photos, blurred shots of him escorted into cars, grainy images of Liang at press conferences, still painful. She runs a finger over her ex-husband's face, then over Liang's. The screenplay doesn't force her to monologue. Her body language says it all. She knows where this road leads, but she also knows she cannot, must not clip her son's wings out of her own history's shadow. The first day of Jun's internship is shot like an initiation ritual. The The Liang Group's main tower, which we've seen only at night as a monolith of glass and secrecy, now stands bathed in morning light, its mirrors reflecting the city back at itself. The lobby hums with activity, but the camera makes time for stillness. Wide shots of the marble floor like a chessboard, escalators moving streams of people upward. The giant lead wall playing a looping video of Liang speaking about ethical growth and building a better tomorrow. The irony isn't hammered, it's baked into the edges. When Jun steps onto the escalator, the movement upward is framed from below, the ceiling's grid lines forming a funnel toward a bright vanishing point above his head. It looks aspirational, but there's also a faint sense of him being pulled into a mechanism larger than himself. His first meeting with Liang is staged with calculated paternal warmth. The older man invites the interns to his private lounge, a space that's deliberately softer than the rest of the building. Warm woods, low seating, framed photos of charity projects instead of abstract art. He moves among them like a benevolent patriarch, asking names, making self-deprecating jokes about his own beginnings. When he reaches Jun, there's a moment, a half-beat longer than with anyone else, where his eyes hold. The performance here is marvelously layered. Liang doesn't let any overt recognition slip. He treats Jun exactly as he treats the others, but the way he listens is slightly more intent. The way he nods just a touch more measured. To us, knowing his knowledge, the geniality is chilling. Jun, for his part, is both dazzled and wary. He's astute enough to know he's in the presence of someone who shapes economies, but also cynical enough from his coursework to wonder what sacrifices paved this road. Yet Liang knows exactly how to puncture that guardedness. He compliments Jun on his question from the recruitment session, referencing the social media clip. "We need more people who are willing to ask uncomfortable questions," he says, tone infused with just the right amount of gravitas. Even in here. The promise embedded in that "even in here" is intoxicating. The idea that Jun could be different from the usual yes men, that he could change the system from within. It's a seduction tailored precisely to the ethical unease the film established earlier. Liang isn't grooming a puppet, he's grooming a believer. Parallel to this subtle manipulation, the film shows Yi beginning his own re-entry into the world of schemes and ledgers. If Liang's methods are polished and institutional, Yi's are improvised and ground level. He starts visiting dingy internet cafes and public libraries, places where anonymous terminals glow in rows. The contrast between the sleek tech infrastructure of Liang Group and the yellowed keyboards Yi uses is striking. Yet there's something almost romantic in the way he navigates outdated interfaces with veterans, cobbling together a mosaic from scraps of public filings, forgotten court documents, and archival news. The editing during these research sequences becomes more staccato, quick cuts between browser tabs, search results, printouts slapped onto a table, highlighter ink bleeding like wounds across paper. The film cleverly uses this phase to explore the notion of digital memory versus human memory. Corporate servers remember selectively. Search engines surface what is profitable to keep visible. But buried in the depths of outdated databases, Yi finds traces of the original scapegoating. Old regulatory notices, bizarrely timed audits, the orchestrated media blitz that destroyed his reputation. The most damning fragments are not smoking guns, but patterns, sudden transfers, synchronized resignations, shell companies that blossom and wither in suspicious alignments. It's detective work without a noir trench coat, all done in sweating bodies hunched over monitors and cheap coffer-stained printouts. What elevates these scenes beyond procedural mechanics is how the sound design captures the reawakening of Yi's strategic brain. We begin to hear faint auditory memories overlaying the present, the echo of younger executives pitch decking, the murmur of board votes, the crisp click of a ballpoint pen on expensive paper. These sonic ghosts blend with the current ambience of whirring CPUs and flickering fluorescent bulbs, creating a palimpsest of time inside his head. At one point, as he traces a corporate ownership chart with his finger, the film briefly overlays a younger version of that hand doing the same motion on a pristine whiteboard 2 decades ago. The past self and present self align for a breath, suggesting that while the world pretended he died, the mind that built an empire simply lay dormant, waiting for a cause worthy of resurrection. The first overt attempt on Yan's well-being is staged as an opportunity. Liang's team assigns him to a high-stakes internal task far beyond what an intern would normally handle, assisting with data reconciliation for a merger deal that has regulators circling. On the surface, it plays like a Cinderella moment. This young man of humble background given privileged access to the inner sanctum. The office where he now works is all glass partitions, ergonomic chairs, and wall-mounted dashboards scrolling real-time data. The camera follows his eyes as he takes it all in, the sense of scope almost dizzying. Yet, embedded in the spreadsheets and code he's asked to help check, there are landmines, numbers that don't quite add up, asset valuations that balloon without clear justification. The tension in these scenes doesn't come from whether Yan will catch the discrepancies. He does, because the film has established him as principled and sharp. The dread comes from what will happen when he does. He flags a set of figures to his immediate supervisor, a mid-level manager with overly bright eyes and a smile a little too fixed. The man assures him it's just a timing recognition issue, corporate speak that sounds plausible enough to a newcomer. But we, seeing the quiet glance that supervisor exchanges with a colleague across the room, understand Yan has stepped into a pre-arranged pit. If regulators later sniff out fraud, the file logs will point to the young intern who missed or signed off on the irregularities. He is being positioned as a disposable fuse. The film cross-cuts this setup with Yi slowly, painfully connecting the dots from his research. He prints out a current organizational chart of Liang Group and overlays it on an old chart from 20 years ago, tracing the through lines of certain names. A subtle visual rhyme emerges. The same legal counsel who engineered his scapegoating now appears on the advisory panel for the mergers committee. A junior auditor he once mentored has risen to a supervisory role in compliance. The machine is different in shape, but many of its gears are the same. Yi realizes with a cold weight settling in his gut that the strategy being used around this merger echoes the one that took him down. Only this time, his son sits exactly where he once sat, in the path of blame. The sequence where these twin realizations, the peril to June, the pattern of Liang's tactics, collide is a masterclass in suspense editing. In one timeline, June stays late at the office, eyes burning as he triple-checks columns of numbers, debating with himself whether his concerns are naive overreaction or genuine red flags. In the other, Yi rushes through night streets, printouts sprawled on the passenger seat, muttering names aloud like incantations. The city outside his windows is a smear of light and motion, echoing the screens of data cascading through his thoughts. The score assembles itself into a kind of musical fugue, overlapping motifs introduced earlier, the driver's nocturnal theme, the corporate battlefield's electronic pulse, the fragile piano lines associated with June. They swirl, clash, and converge into an anxious crescendo. When Yi finally stops the car and storms into a 24-hour copy shop to fax certain documents to an investigative journalist whose name he reluctantly digs up from an old contact list, there's a rawness to his movements that we haven't seen before. His careful, minimal physicality is gone, his suddenly all-sharp angles and impatient gestures. He is gambling now, not on financial markets, but on attention. He wants someone with a platform to take interest in the merger, in the irregularities, in the history. But as he mails the envelope, hands trembling slightly, the film undercuts any simple heroism by showing us the journalist's office at that moment, overrun with deadlines, piles of tips and leaks, editors triage in crisis. The envelope will arrive, but whether anyone will open it in time is left uncertain. This is not a story where truth alone has power. It's one where timing is everything. The film engineers the first direct entanglement of father and son, not through past ties, but through present danger. It happens on a stormy evening when Jun, exhausted and wired from days of high-pressure work, stumbles out of the Liang Tower into rain that turns the whole financial district into a shimmering, unstable mirror. His phone buzzes, a notification from a friend urging him to join a late-night celebration at a bar across town. He hesitates, glancing back at the building looming above him, its logo glaring down like an unblinking eye. Then, like any 20-something desperate to feel alive after too many hours under fluorescent lights, he hails a ride. The driver app assigns him by algorithm to the nearest available car. This time, Yi doesn't have time to decide. He's already in motion, gripping the wheel when Jun's name and pickup location flash before him. There is a moment, one single perfect moment, where he could cancel. Another driver icon hovers nearby on the map. He stares at the screen, feeling his chest tighten. Then the rain slams more insistently against the windshield, like fingers drumming a countdown. He taps the accept. It's not courage, exactly. It's something more feral, a parental instinct finally overriding the fear that has governed him for 2 decades. The pickup scene plays out almost eerily like their earlier near accident, but inverted. This time, it's Jun darting through sheets of rain toward Yi's headlights, hoodie soaked, hair plastered to his forehead. The wipers carve brief windows of clarity through the water. When Yi unlocks the doors, Jun collapses into the back seat with a groan of relief, shaking off droplets. The air inside the car fills with the smell of wet fabric and youthful sweat, a sense that for Yi is achingly reminiscent of a toddler's damp clothes after playing in sprinklers. He glances into the rear and their eyes meet again, this time without anger, without adrenaline, just 2 men sheltering from a storm, unaware that one carried the other's face in his own bone structure. Jun recognizes him vaguely from the earlier incident, and there's a flicker of sheepishness in his expression. "You're the guy who almost hit me, right?" he says, voice softer this time, laced with embarrassment at his previous outburst. Yi nods once, throat tight, uttering the briefest affirmation. The script doesn't let him launch into some monologue. It understands that real people can barely string together coherent sentences under this kind of emotional weight. They talk instead about the rain, the city, banalities that skim the surface of a much deeper current. Jun complains about work stress in non-specific terms, mentioning corporate nonsense and feeling like a small cog. Yi responds with understated comments that hover on the edge of advice without revealing too much. "When they rush you," he says quietly at one point, "it's rarely for your benefit. Take your time, read everything twice." It's a line loaded with his history, but to Jun, it's just an unexpectedly insightful bit of life coaching from a ride driver. The cinematography in this car sequence is subtly magical. Streetlights smear across the windows in long golden streaks. The interior is lit mostly by the instrument panel and the muted glow of Jun's phone screen. The camera oscillates between front-facing shots of Yi and over-the-shoulder angles from the back seat, capturing the discrepancy between what each man sees. From Yi's angle, Jun is a miracle of returned possibility. From Jun's angle, Yi is a tired, kind-eyed stranger whose face he has no reason to scrutinize beyond basic human curiosity. The score stays mostly out of the way, content to let the rain and the engine fill the silence, with just a few low notes slipping in when their gazes linger just a fraction longer than necessary. When Jun reaches his destination, a bustling bar pulsing with neon and bass, he hesitates before getting out. Perhaps because he senses something fatherly in the older man's demeanor, perhaps because the alcohol he plans to consume feels like an acknowledged mistake before he's even taken a sip. He asks a question he's been carrying for years. "Do you ever regret not being there for someone?" He phrases it clumsily, eyes fixed on the raindrops running down his window. Yi's entire body reacts as if struck. The camera closes in on his face, every muscle in his jaw tensing, his grip on the steering wheel white-knuckled. This is not a question about traffic or career advice. It's the question of a son who grew up with a story shaped like a tombstone. The scene could easily tip into melodrama, but the filmmakers hold back. Yi doesn't break down, he doesn't confess. He just listens, eyes glistening, then offers one quiet line that threads the needle between truth and concealment. Sometimes, he says, the stories we're given about the past are just armor, heavy but protective. One day you decide whether to keep wearing it. It's advice, it's apology, it's foreshadowing. Jen, interpreting it through the lens of his own struggles with corporate myth-making, nods thoughtfully. He has no idea he's being gently prepared for the shattering of his personal myth. Origin story. While this delicate emotional scaffolding is being built, the external plot hurtles toward a fuse. Liang, growing impatient with the slow grind of anonymous articles and data leaks, makes a bolder move. If he won't stay buried, he'll be forced into the open in a context Liang can control. The plan is elegant in its cruelty. Stage a controlled leak of sanitized documents about the old scandal to a friendly media outlet ahead of the merger announcement. Frame Yi as an unstable, disgruntled ex-employee who has resurfaced to claim credit and stir up baseless accusations. Position Liang as the long-suffering steward who cleaned up his mess. Use John as the unwitting bridge. Invite him to a high-profile investor summit where Liang publicly praises our young talent and in a choreographed moment mentions his late father's generation as a contrast to the new ethical leadership represented by people like John. The summit sequence is the film's visual apotheosis of corporate theater. It takes place in a cavernous convention center decked out like a temple to capital. Enormous screens displaying swirling graphics, a stage flanked by tasteful greenery and minimalist sculptures, rows upon rows of suited bodies. The lighting is almost divine, beams of white spotlight slicing through artificial haze. The camera prowls through this space with a predatory grace, picking up snippets of conversations about valuations, market share, and geopolitical risk. Against this backdrop, John feels simultaneously elevated and dwarfed. He's given a seat near the front, a sleek nameplate in front of him. When his name lights up on the big screen as part of a future leader segment, the crowd applauds politely. The moment is designed to flatter his ego, to bind him to the house that is already setting his place as a shield. Outside, unbeknownst to John, a different kind of staging is unfolding. Liang, tipped off by a sympathetic former colleague who still works in logistics, arrives at the summit grounds not as an invited guest, but as part of the invisible army that makes events like this run. Drivers, caterers, stagehands. The film makes a point of shifting perspective to show the hidden infrastructure, the loading docks, the labyrinth of service corridors, the tech booths humming with engineers. Yi moves through these spaces with purposeful anonymity, wearing a generic staff lanyard, pushing a cart. The irony is sharp. A man who once commanded entire floors of such venues now slips unnoticed beneath them in overalls. The emotional charge in these parallel movements, John ascending into the gilded hall, Yi disappearing into its bowels, is amplified by the score, which layers their respective themes together in uneasy counterpoint. Every time the camera cuts from the son under spotlight to the father under fluorescent backlights, the dissonance sharpens. We know, even if they do not yet, that they are both being used as props in Liang's narrative. One as a symbol of the new, one as a specter of the old. What neither Liang nor his scriptwriters anticipate is that ghosts, once made visible, have a way of rewriting the story. The moment of collision is engineered with merciless precision. Liang's keynote speech begins as a familiar performance, humble origins, global vision, the obligatory nods to stakeholders and communities. His rhetoric is smooth, his cadence honed by years of investor calls. Midway through, the lights dim, and the screens begin to play a curated video about the company's journey, complete with stock montage footage and stirring music. In a move that would seem magnanimous to the uninformed, the narrative briefly acknowledges the turbulence of our early years, showing anonymized silhouettes to represent difficult leaders who could not adjust to the demands of transparency. The subtext is clear. The old guard was flawed, the new order is righteous. Then comes the twist. As part of a calculated ploy to preempt any chatter about the resurfaced investigation article, Liang invites a surprise guest onto the stage, a former regulator who in reality was complicit in the original scapegoating of Yi. The man delivers a kind endorsement of Liang Group's current practices, emphasizing how far they've come from the chaos of the past. It's a preemptive absolution. But as he speaks, a ripple passes through the back of the hall where the tech crew sits. An image flickers on one of the auxiliary monitors, an image that wasn't in the approved deck. This is where the groundwork of Yi's nocturnal research and desperate outreach pays off. One of the younger techs, sympathetic to whistleblowers after seeing the journalist's article go viral in certain online circles, has agreed to a risky favor. Insert a single, unapproved slide into the livestream and internal feed at a precise moment. That slide contains a side-by-side comparison of financial flows from 20 years ago and the present merger, showing identical shell companies and timing anomalies. It's not bombastic, it's quietly damning. It's proof that the pattern is not coincidence, that the same playbook is being used again with different sacrificial lambs. The rescue that follows is not choreographed as superheroics. It's desperate, clumsy, brutally physical. Yi sprints down the corridor, joints protesting, shoes slipping on damp concrete. The camera runs with him, motion slightly unstable, breath loud in the mix. He crashes into the freight bay just as a section of ceiling near the shaft begins to crumble under the strain of the malfunctioning machinery. Jun turns, startled, phone halfway to his ear. Time seems to dilate. Dust motes hang in the air like suspended ash. The shriek of tearing cable reverberates through the confined space. Yi doesn't shout his son's name. He can't. It would mean nothing yet. He just bellows an instinctive warning and barrels into Jun, shoving him hard out of the shaft's direct path. They tumble across the floor as a piece of metal shearing off from above slams down where Jun stood moments before, sending shards skittering. The impact knocks the wind out of both of them. The sound of the crash rings in their ears. The high-pitched tinnitus eclipses everything for a moment. When the dust begins to settle, Jun blinks up to see the same driver he's twice encountered, now lying partially across him, blood trickling from a cut at his temple. The shot composition in this aftermath is painfully intimate. The two men are framed in a tight two-shot, faces inches apart, chests heaving in synchrony. There are no dramatic beams of light, just the harsh overhead fluorescence and the drifting dust. Jun's first words are a breathless, bewildered, "You again." The mixture of déjà vu and shock in his tone undercuts the terror with a sliver of absurdity, reminding us how life refuses to package pivotal events neatly. Yi, panting, manages a pained half-smile. "I told you, watch where you're going," he rasps, voice breaking on the last word, which we hear is freighted with far more than physical direction. Security and building staff swarm in, alarms blaring. Someone radios for medical assistance. In the chaos, the underlying truth of what nearly happened is in danger of being scrubbed away as equipment failure. Just another line in a report. But one figure in the crowd sees too much. A junior safety inspector who had been quietly uneasy about being reassigned away from the freight area earlier that day. The camera catches her watching the suspiciously quick arrival of certain executives, the way their eyes flip to Jun and then to the damaged machinery, calculating. She doesn't speak yet, but the seed of a whistleblowing is planted. The fallout from this incident and from the summit's briefly hijacked screen shifts the film from covert maneuvers to open confrontation. Yi is taken to a hospital for his head wound, refusing to give his name to anyone but the paramedic, who insists on it. Jun, shaken, tries to visit him later, curiosity and gratitude mingled. It's in the sterile quiet of a hospital room, late at night, that the film finally stages the revelation it has been circling with such agonizing patience. The room is dim, lit mostly by the bluish glow of monitors and the weak spill from the hallway through a half-open door. Yi lies on the bed, bandage white against his dark hair, features softened by exhaustion. When Jun enters, he hesitates at the threshold, the weight of all their strange crossings pressing on him. He steps closer, pulls up a chair, sits. For a while, he just watches the older man breathe. The rise and fall of his chest somehow hypnotic. It feels like watching the tide of his own life without knowing why. What triggers the unmasking is not a plot device, but a mundane object. A worn leather wallet that fell from Ye's pocket during the accident, placed now on the bedside table by a nurse. As Jun idly fiddles with it, it falls open, revealing an old creased photograph tucked behind a faded ID. He picks it up, intending to be respectful, and put it back, but his eyes land on the image and freeze. The photo is of a young couple with a toddler between them, taken in some park long ago. The woman is unmistakably his mother, younger, laughing at the camera. The child is himself, chub-cheeked, clutching a toy. The man holding him, hand resting protectively on his small shoulder, is the same face now lying in the hospital bed. Less lined, hair fuller, but undeniably him. The sound drops to a low tinnitus-like hum. The camera moves into Jun's face as realization detonates behind his eyes. His breathing quickens, fingers tightened around the photo until it threatens to crumple. There's a split second where denial flares. This could be a coincidence, a doctored image. But it dies quickly in the face of the sheer tidal wave of recognition cresting over him. The shape of that jaw he sees in his own mirror, the curve of that smile he's caught fleetingly in his mother's eyes when she thought he wasn't looking. The timbre of that voice that has felt right in his bones from the first sorry in a rain-slick street. Yes stirs, sensing movement, perhaps roused more by the shift in the room's emotional temperature than by physical sound. His eyes flutter open and lock onto Jun's. There is no going back. The hospital's beep and whir recede, replaced by the thunder of both their hearts, bled subtly into the sound design. Jun's voice, when it comes, is a whisper shredded by disbelief and betrayal. "Is this you?" He holds up the photo with a hand that shakes. The actor playing Ye lets an ocean move across his features in silence, shocked that the secret is out, terror at the hurt he's about to inflict, a fragile, luminous joy that his son is finally saying "you" to him in a way that acknowledges connection. He doesn't bother to lie. The entire arc of the film has been about him avoiding this moment. To dodge it now would collapse the story's integrity. "Yes," he answers, voice raw. Then, because there is no script for this kind of reunification, he adds almost apologetically, "I was afraid that if I ever said it, I'd break everything." The conversation that follows is not tidy catharsis. It's messy, halting, charged with years of absence. Jun oscillates between anger and an almost childlike need for answers. "You were dead," he says at one point, the words tumbling out in a choked laugh that is anything but amused. "All this time you were just driving people around?" The contempt there is sharp, directed less at the job than at the perceived smallness of the life his father chose. Ye absorbs it without flinching. "I was hiding," he says plainly. "Not from you. From them, but from you too, I suppose." The film resists the temptation to dump exposition here. Instead, it lets these men dance around specifics, focusing on feelings. Jun demands to know why his mother lied, why no one told him the truth. Ye doesn't throw his ex-wife under the bus. He acknowledges his own role, his request that she cut ties for safety. "Every story I could have told you had a knife in it," he confesses, "about friendship, about trust, about money." I thought if you never heard my name, those knives would swing wider. The irony, of course, is that Yan is already entangled in those blades via Liang. What's quietly devastating is the moment when Jun, tears finally spilling, asks the question that matters more than any corporate intrigue. If they hadn't, if you hadn't, would you have stayed? Or was I just another asset you walked away from? The pause before Yi answers is filled with the faint hiss of oxygen through a tube, the distant echo of a nurse's footsteps in the hallway, mundane hospital sounds that in this context feel like the universe holding its breath. I have failed at many things, Yi says, each syllable heavy. Deals, alliances, reading men who turned out to be snakes. But the thing I have failed at most completely is being your father. That is the regret I wake up with, not the money. I left to keep you safe. Then I stayed gone because I was ashamed. That shame turned into a habit, and habits feel like fate until something forces you to move. Visually, the film bookends itself with driving, but transformed. In the closing sequence, we see Yi behind the wheel again, but the camera's relationship to him has changed. No longer is he observed distantly in a rear view, face chopped by headrests and framed by other people's reflections. Instead, the camera rides shotgun on equal plane with him, sometimes even in the back seat, watching him and Jun talk. The car is the same model, still modest, still bearing the scar of a repaired fender from that near accident, yet the way it's lit is different. The window glare softer, the colors warmer, the city outside less hostile, more textured. There's a quiet scene where Yi is teaching Jun to drive stick on an empty rooftop parking garage at dusk. It's almost comically belated. Jun is already licensed, already competent, but the point isn't instruction, it's ritual. The grinding of gears, the awkward starts and stops, the shared laughter when the car lurches, all become a language through which they negotiate trust. The city skyline glows in the background, towers silhouetted against a bruised sky. Among them is the Liang Group building, its logo now dimmed, signage partly removed. It looms, but smaller now, both in the frame and in their minds. The final image the film leaves us with is not a toppling skyscraper or a courtroom victory. It's Yi alone once more in the car, late at night, the passenger seat empty this time, but the solitude feels different. He's not working a shift, he's simply driving, aimless, the city rolling past. The camera drifts in close as he pulls up to a red light, the glow bathing his face. On the dashboard, his driver app is off, the phone is dark. No beeps, no pings. For the first time, perhaps, he is not on call to anyone, neither corporate overlords nor anonymous passengers. The only sound is a faint radio station playing an old song about roads and homecomings. He rests his hands lightly on the wheel, inhales, exhales, and in that breath you can feel the weight of empire, exile, revenge, and something more fragile, the possibility of a life lived not in reaction to harm, but in chosen presence. As the light turns green, he doesn't surge forward, he eases into motion, the camera lingering on his profile, then slowly tilting up to catch the reflection of passing streetlights on the windshield. Those streaks of light, which in the opening were smeared chaotic, now move in deliberate flowing lines. The score rises, not in triumph, but in a clear, bittersweet melody that feels like acceptance. And then, just as the city's hum and the music reach a tender equilibrium, the screen cuts to black. No climactic chord, just a quiet fade, inviting us to sit with what we've seen. Ayah Konglomerat Kembali Untuk Balas Dendam succeeds in its final accounting not because it delivers a satisfying revenge, but because it refuses to pretend revenge is ever truly satisfying. It drags the corporate revenge fantasy through the mud of accountability, forcing its protagonist and its audience to face the systems that turn people into instruments, memories into commodities, and fathers into footnotes. It uses the familiar iconography of boardrooms, chauffeured cars, gleaming towers, and late-night monitors not as empty style, but as form reflecting content. Glass as both transparency and imprisonment, elevators as ladders and traps, rain-licked roads as the shifting moral terrain of a world where profit has long overrun conscience. What lingers after the credits is not the image of Liang's slight slump as he exits his office for the last time, nor even the viral clips of Yi dismantling a titan on live television. It's smaller things: a cracked phone with an old message finally answered, a conversation in a hospital hallway where a lifetime of lies begins to unknot, a bowl of rice passed from son to father with unthinking care, a rooftop parking lot where the grinding of gears becomes a kind of forgiveness. The film suggests reclamation doesn't look like reclaiming a throne. It looks like reclaiming the right to show up, to speak, to be flawed in front of the people who carry your name. In a landscape crowded with glossy dramas about tycoons and vendettas, this story carves out its own space by grounding its operatic stakes in the granular textures of labor, memory, and family. Its cinematography wields glass and reflection like knives. Its sound design wraps quiet scenes in almost tactile ambiance. Its performances burrow under the skin with their nuanced restraint. Above all, it dares to ask whether a man who once defined himself entirely by what he owned can find a self-worth living for when all he can offer is the truth and his presence. The answer it gives is imperfect, conflicted, and all the more moving for it. Here on Scene Craft Review, this is the kind of film that doesn't just roll past your eyes. It takes up residence somewhere deeper, replaying itself in stray reflections on car windows and in the pressed silence between parents and child at a dinner table. If you've stayed with this journey through the rain-licked streets, the fluorescent corridors, the glass towers, and the dim rented rooms, then you know this isn't a story you simply finish. It's one you metabolize over time. I want to hear how it landed for you. Did you find yourself siding with Yi's rage or recoiling from the cost of his choices? Did Jun's conflict between ambition and conscience feel uncomfortably familiar? If this deep dive into Ayah Konglomerat young Kembali Untuk Balas Dendam stirred something in you, whether admiration, discomfort, or that lingering, hard-to-name regret, great cinema often leaves behind, remember to let the algorithm know this kind of long-form exploration matters. Hit that like button if you haven't already, not just as a reflex, but as a signal that you want more stories taken apart with this level of care. Subscribe to Scene Craft Review if you want to keep walking into films like this together, scene by scene, cut by cut, peeling back performance and framing and sound until the bones of meaning show through. And most importantly, drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me where you think Yi went too far or not far enough. Tell me if you believe someone like Liang ever falls or just shifts shape. Tell me if you too have ever looked at a parent and realized there was an entire unwritten history behind the version of them you were given. Cinema like this thrives on conversation as much as on craft. So take a breath, sit with what this film has pressed into you, and then join the discussion below. Until the next frame, the next story, the next set of shadows flickering on a screen, keep your eyes open for the reflections in glass, the ones that show not just the world as it is, but the lives we might yet reclaim from the stories that tried to erase us.